From shepherd to king, the rise of Tewodros II, a visionary leader who dreamed of a modern Africa. Our real story today is about a legend more sensational than fictitious Hollywood superhero movies, a figure whose story is removed from schools in Ethiopia, yet studied in depth at universities in Europe. Some institutions, such as Oxford University, even offer full courses dedicated to his history and leadership style. Before starting our story, let us explore testimonies from both his enemies and friends by directly quoting their words. Walter Plowden, British consul in Ethiopia, diplomat, and close observer of Ethiopian affairs. Walter Plowden, who witnessed Tewodros' rise and served as a trusted foreign advisor, marveled at his relentless drive for unity and progress. In the wild heart of Africa, I met a man unlike any other, a king forged in fire, a warrior of unmatched will. Tewodros II does not rule Ethiopia. He is Ethiopia. He dreams not of conquest, but of industry, innovation, and a nation free from stagnation. If fate had placed him in Europe, he would have stood among the greatest emperors of the modern age. Antoine Thomson d'Abadie, French explorer and geographer, known for his extensive travels in Ethiopia. Having traveled across Ethiopia and studied its rulers, Antoine d'Abadie was astonished by Tewodros' relentless passion for modernization. Tewodros is not merely a ruler, he is the very soul of his nation. His ambition is boundless, his courage unshaken, and his destiny undeniable. Unlike the warlords before him, he does not seek only to rule, he seeks to transform. His mind is a forge of progress, where the fires of engineering, technology, and education burn as fiercely as his sword on the battlefield. He is Ethiopia's Peter the Great. Émile Genveau, French traveler and chronicler of Ethiopian affairs. Émile Genveau, who documented Ethiopian society, noted how Tewodros personally studied European science, engineering, and military technology to advance his country. I have seen kings adorned in silk and gold, yet none command the loyalty of their people, as Tewodros does in his simple cloak. He is a man of action, a leader who walks among his soldiers, not above them. More than a warrior, he is a man of science, speaking of steam engines, modern artillery, and the power of industry. He does not merely rule, he builds. He does not dream, he engineers reality. Clements Markham, British geographer and historian, known for his studies on African rulers and European exploration. Clements Markham, who compared Tewodros to the great rulers of history, saw him as a genius obsessed with modernizing Ethiopia. Like Peter the Great, Tewodros dreams beyond his time. He sees Ethiopia not as it is, but as it must be. A mighty empire standing tall among the nations of the world. He speaks of mechanical workshops, industrial power, and economic self-sufficiency, where Ethiopia will no longer depend on foreigners for arms or knowledge. If he had lived in another era, he would have built factories, railways, and great cities, shaping Africa's first true industrial empire. Henry Blanc, British surgeon and prisoner of Tewodros, who later wrote about the emperor's genius and reforms. Dr. Henry Blanc, who spent time as a captive of Tewodros but later admired him, remarked on the emperor's intellect and progressive thinking. Emperor Tewodros II is no mere king. He is a man possessed by the future. He studies cannons and workshops with the same intensity that he studies battle strategy. He envisions Ethiopia not as a land of feuding princes, but as a powerful state, armed with knowledge, industry, and the sciences. If given the tools of Europe, he would have built the greatest empire Africa has ever known. Introduction. In the vast and rugged highlands of Ethiopia, where mountains stretch into the sky and rivers carve deep valleys through the land, a young shepherd walked barefoot across the grass, guiding his flock. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and damp earth, and the distant sound of village life echoed through the hills. This boy, unknown to the world beyond his small community, had no crown on his head, no palace to call his own. Yet, he would one day rise to become a leader, a warrior, and a king who would shape the destiny of an entire nation. This is the story of that shepherd, a boy named Kassa, whose journey from humble beginnings to the heights of power was filled with struggle, determination, and the unshakable belief that he was meant for something greater. In a time when Ethiopia was divided into rival territories, ruled by powerful warlords who fought for control, Kassa's path to leadership was not easy. He did not inherit a kingdom, nor was he born into a family of rulers. Instead, he was a child of the countryside, growing up among farmers and herders, learning the ways of the land before he learned the ways of war. Like many boys of his age, Kassa's life was simple but challenging. He spent his days tending to sheep, climbing hills in search of fresh pastures, and listening to the stories of elders who spoke of past kings, legendary warriors, and the changing fate of their land. These tales stirred something deep inside him, a desire to be more than just a shepherd, to leave his mark on the world. But the road from a boy with dreams to a man of power is never straightforward. Ethiopia, at the time of Kassa's childhood, was a land of both beauty and conflict. Though rich in history and culture, the country was divided, its regions ruled by different nobles who often fought for control. These warlords, known as the Ras in Ethiopian history, Ras is a high-ranking noble and military title, often equivalent to a duke or general in European terms. The title is derived from the Amharic word for head or chief, and it signifies a person of great authority, both in military and political matters. Ruled their territories like kings, collecting taxes, commanding armies, and seeking more power. For a young shepherd born into poverty, the chances of rising above his station seemed nearly impossible. But Kassa was not like most boys. He was sharp, observant, and had a fire in his heart that would not be easily extinguished. He was not content with a life of quiet obedience. Though he respected the traditions of his people, he questioned why some men ruled while others suffered, why some had riches while others had nothing. He watched the powerful with both admiration and skepticism. His mother, a strong and determined woman, played a key role in shaping his early views. She was not a queen, but she carried herself with the dignity of one. She taught Kassa about leadership, justice, and the importance of standing firm in one's beliefs. Even as they struggled through hardship, she filled his mind with stories of Ethiopia's great past, reminding him that true leaders rise not because of wealth or birthright, but because of their strength, wisdom, and courage. As he grew older, Kassa's desire for a different life became stronger. He was no longer just a boy tending sheep. He was a young man observing the world, learning its ways, and preparing himself for something greater. But the journey ahead would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. He would face betrayal, hardship, and war. He would experience loss and pain. And yet, with each challenge, he would grow stronger. This is the story of Kassa, the shepherd boy who dared to dream beyond the hills of his childhood, the young man who would rise, not just to lead, but to transform his nation. His journey was not just one of power, but of purpose. He was not merely a warrior, he was a visionary, a ruler who sought to unite a land torn apart by conflict. From the quiet countryside to the battlefields of kings, from a humble beginning to a throne, this is the tale of how a shepherd became an emperor. His name would be remembered for generations. His rise would be written in history. This is the story of Emperor Tewodros II of Ethiopia. He did not want to remain a simple shepherd forever. Seeing his potential, Kasa's uncle, Dejach Kinfu, to add some context, Deja Zimach, often shortened as Dejach, was a high-ranking noble and military title in Ethiopian history. It roughly translates to Commander of the Gate and was primarily given to governors, warlords, and military leaders. The title was second only to Ras in the hierarchy of Ethiopian nobility, arranged for him to receive an education at the Mahbere Selassie Monastery. It was a place of deep religious learning, where monks taught young boys to read and write, study religious texts, and memorize important prayers. Kasa was a quick learner, excelling in Dawit, the Psalms of David, and other traditional Ethiopian teachings. But the monastery was not just a place of learning, it was also a place of danger. One day, a brutal attack shattered the peace of Mahbere Selassie. A nobleman named Dejachi Maru, who sought revenge against the aristocracy, led a massacre of young students. The attack was horrifying, and many of Kasa's classmates were killed. But Kasa managed to escape. He ran back to his home in Kwara, his heart filled with fear and anger. That event changed him forever. He no longer saw himself as just a student or a shepherd. He knew that survival in Ethiopia required strength, courage, and the ability to fight back. With no father to guide him and no wealth to support him, Kasa was forced to make a choice: continue living as a powerless peasant or carve his own path to a better future. He chose the latter. Leaving behind his quiet life in Kwara, he set out on a journey that would take him from a simple shepherd to a leader of men, a warrior, and ultimately, a king. His story was just beginning. He knew that survival in Ethiopia required strength, courage, and the ability to fight back. With no father to guide him and no wealth to support him, Kasa was forced to make a choice: continue living as a powerless peasant or carve his own path to a better future. He chose the latter. Leaving behind his quiet life in Kwara, he set out on a journey that would take him from a simple shepherd to a leader of men. His story was just beginning. It was a time known as the Zemene Mesafint, or the Era of Princes, a period when the country had no strong central ruler. Instead, powerful warlords resting in the hands of these rival princes. Chapter 2: A Land in Chaos. In the early 19th century, Ethiopia was a land divided. It was a time known as the Zemene Mesafint, or the Era of Princes, a period when the country had no strong central ruler. Instead, powerful warlords, known as Ras and Dejach, controlled different regions, constantly fighting for power. While Ethiopia had an emperor in name, he was little more than a figurehead, with real authority resting in the hands of these rival princes. The country was in a state of endless warfare. Each noble sought to expand his influence, leading to frequent battles that devastated villages, destroyed farms, and left ordinary people struggling to survive. Ethiopia, once ruled by great emperors who had unified the land, had now become a collection of warring territories. The dream of a strong and united Ethiopia seemed far away. For people like Kasa Haile and his mother, life under this system was harsh and uncertain. They had no noble blood, no land to call their own, and no protection from the constant conflicts. Farmers feared that their crops would be stolen by roaming armies. Families were torn apart as young men were forced into military service by local warlords. Trade and commerce suffered because the roads were unsafe, and bandits thrived in the lawless countryside. Young Kasa watched as warlords ruled with brutality and greed, using their power to exploit the weak. He saw how the rich feasted while the poor struggled to find food. He listened to the cries of mothers who had lost their sons to war. He understood that in a land where power was everything, those without it had no future. Despite this chaos, Kasa saw an opportunity. He realized that Ethiopia needed a leader who could end the endless fighting and bring the people together under a single rule. But to do that, he first had to find his own strength, learn the ways of war, and challenge those who held power. He could not do this as a simple shepherd. He would have to become something greater. The time for dreaming was over. The time for action had begun. Chapter 3. A young rebel emerges. The bloodshed at Mahbere Selassie changed Kasa Hailu forever. The monastery, once a place of learning and prayer, had turned into a battlefield. The ruthless warlord Dejachmaru and his men had stormed the sacred halls, massacring students and monks in a violent act of revenge. Kasa, who had once been immersed in religious teachings, now found himself running for his life. He barely escaped the slaughter, but the horrors he had witnessed stayed with him. The cries of his fallen classmates echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he understood that Ethiopia was not just a land in chaos. It was a place where only the strong survived. With no home to return to and no safety in the monastery, Kasa made a bold decision. He would no longer be a passive observer of Ethiopia's suffering. If the powerful warlords could shape the country with force, he would learn their ways and carve his own path to power. But where could a young man without noble blood or wealth begin such a journey? The answer lay in the rugged hills of Kwara, where rebel groups and bandits roamed freely. These were men who had been cast out by society, former soldiers, desperate peasants, and ambitious fighters looking to make a name for themselves. They lived outside the rule of the warlords, surviving by raiding caravans, collecting tribute from villages, and occasionally fighting as mercenaries. It was a harsh and dangerous life, but Kasa saw it as an opportunity. If he could gain their respect, he could turn them into something more than just lawless bandits. At first, he was just another young recruit, learning the ways of survival from seasoned fighters. He trained with the sword and the spear, studied ambush tactics, and learned how to move through the mountains unseen. He watched how leaders commanded their men, how they motivated them with promises of wealth or revenge. More importantly, he saw their weaknesses, the greed, the lack of discipline, the short-sightedness that kept them from becoming more than just scattered groups of raiders. It did not take long for Kasa to stand out. He was not only a skilled fighter, but a thinker, a strategist. While others fought for food and silver, he spoke of something greater, a cause that could unite them. He told his men that they were not just rebels. They were warriors of a new Ethiopia, one that would be ruled by strength and justice, not greed and corruption. His ideas resonated with many. Slowly, Kasa built a following. He led successful raids, outmaneuvered stronger enemies, and shared his spoils with those who needed them most. Unlike other bandit leaders, he was not driven by personal gain. He had a vision, and his men began to believe in it. From the ashes of a massacre and the shadows of the wilderness, a leader was born. Kasa Hailu was no longer just a shepherd or a runaway student. He was now a warrior, a rebel, and a rising force in Ethiopia's struggle for power. His journey had only just begun, but the warlords who ruled the land would soon learn his name and fear it. Chapter 4. Learning from the Nobles. Kasa Hailu had spent years in the wilderness, rising from an ordinary shepherd to a respected rebel leader. He had learned the art of war from outlaws and fighters, but if he wanted to rule Ethiopia, he needed to understand more than just battle. He had to learn the ways of the nobility, the customs, the alliances, and the politics that controlled the land. For this, he would need to step out of the shadows and into the world of Ethiopia's ruling class. His chance came when Dejach Goshu, a powerful noble from Gojam, and Ras Ali, the most influential warlord of the time, took an interest in him. They saw potential in the young rebel and decided to bring him into their circle. Instead of fighting against them, Kasa agreed to serve under them. He knew that if he wanted to rise to power, he first had to learn from those who already held it. At the courts of Ras Ali and Dejach Goshu, Kasa saw a world completely different from the one he had known in the countryside. Here, nobles wore fine robes, dined on lavish feasts, and spoke in the language of diplomacy and strategy. Kasa observed everything. He studied their royal etiquette, their manner of speaking, and the subtle ways in which power was exercised, not just through war, but through alliances and influence. But he also saw the weaknesses of the ruling class. The nobles were divided, greedy, and more focused on their own wealth than on the unity of Ethiopia. They lived in comfort, while ordinary people suffered. Kasa realized that these men were not the leaders Ethiopia needed. They were part of the reason the country was broken. Still, his time with them was not wasted. He had the opportunity to prove himself as a warrior in battle. When the Egyptians advanced into Sudan, threatening Ethiopia's western borders, Kasa was given his first chance to fight in a large-scale war. At the Battle of Sennar, he fought with incredible bravery, earning the respect of soldiers and nobles alike. His courage and skill in combat made him famous, and soon he was granted the title Liege, a title of nobility usually reserved for those of royal blood. This new status came with another opportunity and another test of his ability to navigate the world of the nobles. To secure his loyalty, Ras Ali's mother, Etegemenen, arranged for Kasa to marry Emperor Tewodros, her granddaughter. This was a political move, meant to tie Kasa to Ras Ali's rule and ensure he remained loyal. For a time, Kasa played along. He married Tewodros, gained more influence, and continued to rise in status. But deep inside, he knew that loyalty to the nobility would never bring him the power he truly sought. The warlords were too corrupt, too consumed by their own rivalries to ever unite Ethiopia. If he wanted to change the country, he could not simply serve under them. He would have to defeat them. Kasa's time among the nobles had taught him valuable lessons. He had learned diplomacy, strategy, and the weaknesses of his enemies. But now, he was ready to forge his own path. He would no longer be a student of the warlords. He would be their greatest rival. Chapter 5. The Rebel with a Cause. For a brief time, Liege Kasa had lived among Ethiopia's ruling class. He had learned their customs, their strategies, and their weaknesses. But no matter how much he proved himself, he was never truly accepted. The aristocracy still saw him as the son of a poor koso seller, a man of no noble birth who had risen too high. They whispered behind his back, mocking him for his humble origins. His marriage to Emperor Tewodros, the granddaughter of Etegemenen, had been meant to keep him loyal to the ruling elites. But instead of bringing him closer to them, it only deepened their resentment. They saw him as an outsider, unworthy of marrying into nobility. Even Tewodros, though deeply devoted to her husband, was not spared from the cruelty of the court. She, too, was ridiculed for marrying a man who was once nothing more than a shepherd. Kassa had spent years observing the nobility, hoping to learn the ways of power. But now he saw them for what they were: corrupt, divided, and unwilling to change. He realized that he would never achieve his dreams by serving them. He had to leave. He had to fight. Tewodros stood by him. Unlike the nobles, she saw the greatness within him, the fire that could not be extinguished by insults or mockery. She encouraged him to follow his own path. And so, together, they turned their backs on the court and became rebels. Kassa gathered a group of loyal followers, warriors who, like him, had been cast aside by the nobility. They were peasants, former soldiers, and outlaws, but under Kassa's leadership, they became a disciplined and determined fighting force. He was not just another bandit leader. He was a man with a vision. He did not fight for wealth or revenge. He fought to end the rule of corrupt warlords and unify Ethiopia under a single, just leader. His first great test came against Tewodros, a nobleman loyal to Ras Ali. Tewodros had mocked Kassa's origins, calling him the son of a koso seller, belittling his ambitions. But Kassa was no longer a man to be insulted without consequence. He led his forces into battle, defeating Tewodros' much larger army with brilliant tactics and fierce determination. When Tewodros was finally captured, Kassa did not kill him outright. Instead, he chose a punishment that would send a message. Remembering how Tewodros had mocked his mother's trade, he forced the defeated nobleman to drink koso, the very medicine his mother had once sold to survive. It was a symbolic revenge. Tewodros was now swallowing the same humiliation he had tried to inflict upon Kassa. With this victory, Kassa's legend grew. He was no longer just a rebellious noble. He was a warrior, a leader, a force to be reckoned with. More and more men flocked to his side, inspired by his courage and his vision for a stronger Ethiopia. The warlords had underestimated the young rebel from Kwara. They had laughed at him, dismissed him, but now they feared him. Kassa had declared war on the old order, and he would not stop until he had reshaped Ethiopia forever. Chapter 6. Battles for Power. By now, Kassa Haile was no longer just a rebel leader. He was a rising force in Ethiopia. His victories had shaken the warlords, and his growing army was becoming a serious threat to the ruling elites. But his enemies were not ready to surrender. They still saw him as an outsider, a commoner who had no right to power. They believed that if they struck hard enough, they could destroy him before he became unstoppable. The first to make such an attempt was Ethiopia, the mother of Ras Ali, who had once tried to control Kassa by arranging his marriage to Emperor Tewodros. Now, seeing Kassa's rebellion growing stronger, she decided to crush him once and for all. She gathered an army of 20,000 soldiers, a force far greater than Kassa's. Confident in her numbers, she marched towards Dembia, ready to end his rebellion. But Kassa was no ordinary fighter. He knew that victory was not just about numbers, it was about strategy. Instead of engaging Menen's forces head-on, Kassa used clever battlefield tactics. He took advantage of the land, positioning his army in a way that forced Menen's troops into unfavorable terrain. He launched surprise attacks, confusing the enemy and disrupting their formations. As the battle raged, Kassa's small but disciplined force overpowered Menen's much larger army. When the dust settled, Kassa emerged victorious. Ethiopia herself was captured and brought before him. Many expected Kassa to execute her as a warning to his enemies, but instead he showed mercy. Unlike the nobles who had mocked and underestimated him, Kasa understood the value of alliances. Instead of killing her, he negotiated a truce, a move that both secured his control over Dembia and forced Ras Ali to recognize his growing power. However, Kasa knew that the war was far from over. More enemies were waiting, and the greatest of them was Dejak Goshu, the ruler of Gojam. He had joined forces with Ras Ali, believing that together they could bring Kasa down. But Kasa, ever the strategist, knew that he could not fight both enemies at once. Instead of facing them together, he decided to divide and conquer. Kasa pretended to retreat, giving his enemies the impression that he was weak and running away. This trick worked. Ras Ali and Dejak Goshu split their forces, with Goshu taking control of Dembia. This was exactly what Kasa wanted. Once Dejak Goshu was isolated, Kasa launched a decisive attack at Guramba. It was one of the most brutal and crucial battles of his campaign. Goshu's forces initially held strong, but as the battle wore on, Kasa's superior tactics and relentless fighters turned the tide. The turning point came when Dejak Goshu himself was struck down by a bullet, falling from his horse and dying instantly. Though victorious, Kasa felt a mix of triumph and sorrow. He had once been a guest in Dejak Goshu's house, and now he had defeated him on the battlefield. But war had no room for sentiment. The fall of Goshu meant that Kasa was now the undisputed ruler of Dembia and Gojam. His enemies were beginning to realize the truth. Kasa was not just another rebel. He was a brilliant tactician, a fearless warrior, and a leader who knew how to win against impossible odds. One by one, his rivals were falling. The dream that once seemed impossible, that of uniting Ethiopia under a single strong leader, was now within his grasp. But before he could claim the throne, there was still one more battle to fight. Chapter 7: The Road to the Throne. With the defeat of Dejak Goshu at Guramba, Kasa Haile had proven himself to be the most powerful military leader in Ethiopia. His victories had shaken the foundations of the old nobility, and his enemies were beginning to realize that he was not just another warlord. He was a man with a mission, a leader determined to unite Ethiopia under one rule. However, there was still one major rival left standing: Ras Ali, the man who had once tried to control Kasa through political alliances and later sought to destroy him. With Goshu dead and Etegemenen defeated, Ras Ali knew that he was now facing Kasa alone. He had no choice but to raise one last massive army, gathering together the remaining forces loyal to him. The final confrontation between the two men took place in Gorgora, near Lake Tana, in June 1852. Ras Ali's army was large, but his soldiers were not as disciplined or motivated as Kasa's. They were fighting to protect the old system, while Kasa's men were fighting to create a new future. When the battle began, it quickly became clear that Kasa had the advantage. His tactics were sharp, his troops well-trained, and his leadership unmatched. One by one, Ras Ali's forces began to collapse, and within hours, the battle turned into a complete rout. As Ras Ali fled the battlefield in defeat, the realization spread across Ethiopia. The era of princes, Zemene Mesafint, was coming to an end. The days of fragmented rule, where warlords and nobles fought endlessly for power, were over. The country now had one true leader, Kasa Haile. However, there was one more challenge before he could fully claim the throne: Dejak Wube of Tigray. Unlike Ras Ali, Wube was not just another noble. He was an ambitious ruler who dreamed of becoming emperor himself. He had strong alliances and controlled a large, well-equipped army. Even more importantly, he had Abune Selama, the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, under his protection. Without the church's blessing, Kasa's rule would not be fully recognized. Kasa understood that to truly unite Ethiopia, he had to defeat Wube and secure the support of the church. So, in 1855, he marched north to confront Wube at Dereska. It was a fierce battle, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But Kasa's army, hardened by years of relentless war, fought with unmatched determination. When Wube's son was killed in battle, his forces lost their morale, and Wube himself was forced to surrender. With Wube defeated, Kasa entered the church of Dereska Mariam, where he was welcomed by the people as their new ruler. 3 days later, in a grand ceremony, Abune Selama crowned him Emperor of Ethiopia. At that moment, Kasa Hailu became Emperor Tewodros II, the first ruler to unify Ethiopia in nearly a century. He had risen from a shepherd boy to a rebel leader, from a warrior to a king. His journey had been filled with hardships, betrayals, and countless battles. But he had achieved what no one else had. He had ended the rule of the warlords and laid the foundation for a modern, unified Ethiopia. However, his greatest challenges were still ahead. Ruling an empire was far more difficult than winning battles, and Tewodros was about to learn that the true test of leadership was not just in conquest, but in governance. Chapter 8: Reuniting Ethiopia. Now crowned as Emperor Tewodros II, the man who had once been a shepherd and a rebel had finally achieved his dream of ruling Ethiopia. But uniting the country in name was not enough. He had to bring true order and stability to a land that had been divided for nearly a century. The warlords had been defeated, but their influence was still strong in many regions. If Ethiopia was to move forward, Tewodros had to ensure that all provinces recognized his authority. From the moment of his coronation, Tewodros made it clear that he wanted to create a strong, centralized Ethiopia. No longer would local warlords rule as independent kings in their own territories. Instead, he envisioned a country with a single government, a professional army, and a fair system of justice. But enforcing this vision would not be easy. Several regional rulers still refused to recognize his authority. And so, once again, Tewodros had to go to war. His first major challenge came from Biru Goshu, a nobleman who ruled over Gojam. Biru had remained loyal to the old system and saw Tewodros as a dangerous threat to the aristocracy. He refused to submit, believing that he could gather enough support to challenge the new emperor. But Tewodros, now at the height of his military power, crushed Biru's forces in a swift and decisive campaign. With Gojam firmly under his control, he turned his attention to the south, where another major rival awaited him. In Shewa, the local ruler, King Haile Melekot, still held significant power. Unlike Biru Goshu, Haile Melekot had the advantage of ruling a relatively stable and wealthy kingdom. He did not openly rebel against Tewodros, but remained independent, refusing to send troops or pay tribute. Tewodros saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. In 1856, he led his army into Shewa, determined to bring the region under imperial control. The campaign was swift and brutal. Tewodros's forces overpowered Haile Melekot's army, forcing the Shewan ruler to retreat into the mountains. However, before he could launch a counterattack, Haile Melekot fell ill and died, leaving Shewa leaderless. His young son, Saleh Mariam, was now the heir to the throne, but he was only 12 years old, too young to rule in such dangerous times. Instead of crushing Shewa completely, Tewodros made a surprising decision. Rather than killing or exiling the boy, he took Saleh Mariam under his protection, bringing him back to his court. Many expected him to treat the young prince as a prisoner, but instead, Tewodros raised him with kindness and respect. He saw potential in the boy and wanted to train him in leadership, military strategy, and governance. He treated Sala Mariam like a son, ensuring that he was given the best education and preparing him for the future. This decision would later shape Ethiopia's history. Sala Mariam would one day grow up to become Emperor Menelik II, the leader who would go on to defeat the Italians at the Battle of Adwa and secure Ethiopia's independence. Though Tewodros did not know it at the time, his act of mercy had helped lay the foundation for the country's future strength. With Gojam and Shewa now under imperial control, Tewodros had achieved what no ruler before him had been able to do. He had truly unified Ethiopia under a single leader. His dream of a strong and modern empire was finally coming to life. But ruling a united Ethiopia would prove to be far more difficult than conquering it. As he turned his attention to governing the empire, new challenges arose, ones that could not be solved with swords and battles alone. Chapter 9: Reforms and Resistance. With Ethiopia finally united under his rule, Emperor Tewodros II turned his attention to what he believed was his true mission: modernizing and strengthening the empire. He had fought for years to end the rule of the warlords, but now he faced a challenge even greater than war: transforming an ancient land into a centralized, organized state. Tewodros had a clear vision for Ethiopia's future. He wanted to build a strong government, create a modern army, reform the tax system, and reduce the influence of corrupt nobles and religious leaders. He believed that only a powerful central authority could prevent Ethiopia from falling back into the chaos of the Zemene Mesafint, era of princes. Building a modern state, one of his first major reforms was the creation of a standing army. In the past, Ethiopian warlords had relied on temporary militias, raising armies only when needed. This system was unreliable, as soldiers would return home once the battle was over. Tewodros wanted a permanent, well-trained military that could enforce his rule and protect Ethiopia from foreign threats. To achieve this, he ordered each region to provide troops and worked on securing modern weapons from European nations. He also reformed the tax system, introducing new tax codes to ensure that the empire had a stable source of income. Traditionally, Ethiopian rulers had relied on land taxes collected by local governors. However, this system allowed regional leaders to grow powerful and corrupt, often keeping much of the wealth for themselves. Tewodros wanted a fair and efficient system, where taxes went directly to the central government rather than through the hands of local nobles. In addition, he attempted to streamline governance, reducing the power of provincial rulers and appointing his own trusted officials to oversee different regions. He envisioned a single united Ethiopia, not a collection of semi-independent provinces ruled by competing nobles. Conflict with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. One of the biggest obstacles to his reforms was the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Although Tewodros was a devout Christian, he believed that the church had become too powerful and corrupt, interfering in politics and resisting change. Many high-ranking church officials lived like nobles, collecting wealth and land while opposing his efforts to centralize power. Tewodros demanded that the church stop supporting rebellious nobles, but when the clergy refused, tensions escalated. He punished priests who openly defied him and even imprisoned Abune Salama, the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This act shocked many, as no emperor before him had dared to take such drastic action. His aggressive stance against the church cost him valuable support from the religious elite, who began to turn against him. Many saw him as a ruler who was not respecting tradition, and this fueled further resistance to his rule. Noble resistance and growing unrest. Tewodros' most determined enemies, however, were the regional nobles. who resented his centralization of power. For generations, Ethiopia's provinces had been ruled by powerful Ares and Dejach, who governed with complete independence. They had grown wealthy through land ownership and taxation, and they were not willing to surrender their privileges to a strong central government. Although Tewodros had defeated many of these nobles in battle, their resistance did not disappear. Instead, they began plotting rebellions against him. Some secretly allied with the Ethiopian church, while others worked to turn the people against Tewodros by spreading rumors that he was trying to destroy Ethiopian traditions. As resistance grew, Tewodros became increasingly frustrated. He had fought so hard to unite Ethiopia, yet now, even after his great victories, his own people were rejecting his reforms. His anger turned to harsh punishments as he cracked down on rebels, imprisoned dissenters, and executed those he saw as threats. His once noble dream of modernizing Ethiopia was now turning into a desperate struggle to maintain control. Despite his efforts, opposition to his rule continued to grow. His own subjects, the very people he had fought to protect, were now beginning to resent his harsh leadership. His dream of a united modern Ethiopia was slipping away, and he could feel the walls of his empire closing in around him. The greatest challenge of his reign was yet to come. Foreign powers were beginning to take notice of the turmoil in Ethiopia, and soon Tewodros would find himself facing an enemy unlike any he had ever fought before. Chapter 10. The Fall of Tewodros. By the 1860s, Emperor Tewodros II had become a ruler trapped between his dreams and his reality. He had fought tirelessly to unite Ethiopia and modernize its government, army, and economy. But instead of loyalty and gratitude, he faced constant resistance from the nobles who resented his authority, from the church that opposed his reforms, and from foreign powers that refused to support him. As his enemies multiplied, Tewodros became increasingly suspicious and harsh. He saw betrayal everywhere, punishing those he suspected of disloyalty with imprisonment, public executions, and brutal military campaigns. His once great vision of a strong, centralized Ethiopia was crumbling under the weight of rebellion and war. War with Britain begins. Tewodros had always admired European technology, particularly their modern weapons. He dreamed of securing European military support to help strengthen Ethiopia's army. In 1862, he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria of Britain requesting an alliance and asking for weapons and skilled craftsmen to help modernize Ethiopia. But the British government, preoccupied with its own affairs, ignored his request. To Tewodros, this was an insult. He believed that as a fellow ruler, he deserved respect and recognition. Feeling betrayed and disrespected, he responded with drastic action. In 1864, Tewodros ordered the arrest of British envoys, including Captain Charles Cameron, who were in Ethiopia at the time. He imprisoned them at Mekdela, his mountain fortress, believing that this would force Britain to respond and negotiate with him. But instead of diplomacy, Tewodros's actions led to one of the most disastrous conflicts of his reign: the British invasion. The British government saw the imprisonment of its citizens as an act of aggression and decided to intervene with force. In 1867, they launched a massive military expedition to rescue the hostages and remove Tewodros from power. The British force was led by General Robert Napier, and it was one of the most powerful military campaigns ever sent to Africa at the time. The British Army consisted of over 12,000 troops, many of whom were highly trained soldiers from India. They came equipped with advanced artillery, rifles, and modern war tactics, far superior to anything Ethiopia had. By early 1868, the British forces landed at Zula, modern-day Eritrea, and began their march towards Mekdela. facing little resistance along the way. Many of Tewodros' former allies, including local nobles, refused to fight for him. Some even helped the British, hoping that Tewodros' downfall would restore their own power. The Battle of Mekdela. On April 10, 1868, the British Army reached Mekdela, Tewodros' mountain stronghold. The fortress was heavily defended, but the Ethiopian forces, armed mostly with spears and outdated muskets, were no match for British artillery and modern rifles. The battle was devastating. Within hours, British cannons tore through Tewodros' defenses, and his army began to collapse. Realizing that defeat was inevitable, Tewodros made one final attempt at peace. He released the British prisoners and sent messengers to General Napier, hoping for negotiations. But it was too late. The British forces continued their advance, determined to crush him. Tewodros' last stand and tragic end. On April 13, 1868, as British troops stormed the gates of Mekdela, Tewodros faced his final decision. He had spent his entire life fighting for Ethiopia's unity and independence, and he refused to be captured alive by foreign invaders. Rather than surrender to the British, Tewodros climbed to the top of his fortress. Dressed in his finest royal robes, he took out a pistol, a gift from a European power years before, and shot himself in the head. The emperor, who had risen from a humble shepherd to a mighty ruler, chose to die on his own terms rather than live in humiliation. The aftermath. When British soldiers found his body, they were both relieved and saddened. General Napier had planned to capture him alive, but now Ethiopia's greatest leader was gone. The British looted Mekdela, taking vast amounts of treasure, religious manuscripts, and even Tewodros' son, Prince Alemayahu, who was sent to England. Tewodros' death marked the end of his dream, but his legacy was far from over. His bold vision of a united modern Ethiopia inspired future generations. The young prince he had once taken under his wing, Saleh Mariam, later Emperor Menelik II, would grow up to defeat the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, ensuring Ethiopia's status as the only African country to resist colonization. Though Tewodros died in tragedy, his courage, vision, and relentless fight for Ethiopia's unity would be remembered for centuries. He was not just a warrior or a king. He was a symbol of Ethiopian resistance, pride, and determination. Chapter 11. The Immortal Legacy of Tewodros. Though Emperor Tewodros II fell on the battlefield of Mekdela, he did not truly die. His name became legend, his spirit immortalized in the very soul of Ethiopia. He was no ordinary king. He was a force of nature, a leader chosen by destiny to reshape a broken land and forge it into an empire that would stand the test of time. Tewodros was not a man content with simply wearing a crown. He did not seek the throne for personal glory or wealth, nor did he rule with selfish ambition. He was a warrior, a visionary, and a father to his people. He saw Ethiopia not as a collection of feuding warlords, but as a great and mighty empire, one that could rival the greatest civilizations of the world. And so, with nothing but his indomitable will, he set out to bend fate itself to his vision. The king who defied the impossible. Tewodros' rise to power was nothing short of a miracle. Born into humble beginnings, he was not given power. He took it with his own hands. He rose from a shepherd tending his flock to the undisputed ruler of Ethiopia, driven by a fire that could not be extinguished. He battled warlords, crushed rebels, and defied entire armies, not for his own gain, but for the sake of his people. Where others saw division, Tewodros saw unity. Where others were content with old ways, he saw a future of strength, modernity, and greatness. He did not rule with fear, but with unshakable conviction. Even his enemies could not help but admire him, for they knew they were standing against a man unlike any other, the unbreakable warrior. The unbreakable warrior, Tewodros, never backed down from a fight. He took on the mightiest of foes and emerged victorious time and time again. His battles were not merely fought with swords and muskets, but with his brilliant mind and boundless courage. His enemies feared him because he was a lion in human form, a ruler whose mere presence could send armies scattering. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, he never surrendered. When the British Empire, the most powerful military force of the 19th century, marched against him, he stood his ground like a titan of legend. Though he was outnumbered, outgunned, and betrayed by lesser men, he refused to kneel. And in his final moments, when all seemed lost, Tewodros made the ultimate choice of a true king. He chose death over dishonor. He did not fall to an enemy's blade, nor did he allow himself to be paraded in chains. Instead, he ascended to eternity on his own terms, leaving behind a legacy that would outshine even the greatest emperors of history. The Eternal Father of Ethiopia. Tewodros did not simply rule Ethiopia, he became Ethiopia. His dream of unity, strength, and independence did not die with him. It lived on in the hearts of his people, in the songs of warriors, and in the very foundations of the Ethiopian state. Every ruler who came after him walked in his shadow, inspired by the vision of an Ethiopia that could never be conquered, never be divided, and never bow to foreign powers. It was his fire that burned in Menelik Tewodros, who later crushed the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, securing Ethiopia's place as the only uncolonized African nation. It was his spirit that lived in the resistance fighters who drove out invaders, ensuring Ethiopia would always remain free. It was his courage that inspired generations of Ethiopians, reminding them that they were born of warriors, led by a king who refused to kneel. Even today, his name is spoken with reverence, his deeds sung in the voices of millions. Statues stand in his honor, books are written in his memory, and his legend echoes through time itself. More than a king, a god of war among men. Tewodros was not just a king. He was a force, a movement, a destiny made flesh. A fierce warrior, he struck fear into his enemies and led his armies with unmatched bravery. A reformer, he sought to unite a fractured land and build a strong, modern Ethiopia. A lover of technology, he dreamed of an industrialized nation, even forging his own cannons to strengthen his kingdom. A just king, he upheld the rule of law and despised corruption, ensuring fairness for all under his reign. A defender of the weak, he protected minorities and championed the powerless, standing as a beacon of justice in turbulent times. He sought to curb the influence of powerful and corrupt Orthodox Church leaders who exploited their positions for personal gain, challenging their unchecked authority. He also fought against economic domination by the nobility, striving to redistribute power and wealth to create a more just and prosperous Ethiopia. His life was a story of conquest, heroism, and ultimate sacrifice. His enemies may have tried to erase him, but they failed, for legends cannot die. To this day, his soul rides the wind over the mountains of Ethiopia, watching over the land he gave everything to protect. His people still march to the rhythm of his dreams, carrying forward the Ethiopia he fought to build. And as long as Ethiopia stands, Tewodros II will never be forgotten.